how do we explain to a child what a helper is if we see people who are helpers doing the hurting, or we see people who are helpers but they're being hurt?
Welcome back to Listen to the Helpers, a podcast created by the Fred Rogers Institute to elevate the voices of helpers everywhere. Fred Rogers once said, "When I was a boy and I would see scary things in the news, my mother would say to me, 'Look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping.'" Today, we're joined by Emma Swift Lee, the director of the Fred Rogers Institute. At the end of this episode, stay tuned as Kenzee and I reflect on our discussion with Emma. Emma, thank you so much for joining us for our first episode of season 2 of Listen to the Helpers. I think this is a great way to kick off the second season with a conversation with the director of the Fred Rogers Institute herself. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. I have been really excited to be on our podcast for the first time. And I wanted to be sure to say thank you so much to both of you, because this idea for the Fred Rogers Institute to have a podcast has been floating in our minds for years now. And we might be the very last organization on earth to have a podcast, but we did it. And we did it because both of you made it happen, and you have just been running with it. And the first season was so wonderful, and you talked to so many great people. And I'm just really excited that we're doing this.
Thank you. And yeah, we're really excited about it too. And we're excited to see how it's grown already, and we're looking forward to seeing it grow even more. But to start us off with our conversation today, we'd love for you to start by, obviously we know you, we know who you are and everything about you, but for anyone listening who hasn't had the pleasure of meeting you yet, could you tell us about yourself, tell us who you are, a little bit about your role at the Fred Rogers Institute, and where you're from?
Sure. I I grew up in Western North Carolina, very near Asheville. So I got to grow up in the mountains, which was wonderful and instilled kind of a lifelong love of being outside. When I'm not at work, I try to be outside as much as I can. I have a 6 year old and a 4 year old, and so my girls and I get out a lot and play. At work, I'm the director of the Institute, which really just means I get to do a little bit of everything here, and I get to support and help make it all happen. Um, some of my job, of course, is fundraising and trying to go after funding so that we can keep doing the work we're doing. But I think I'm very, very fortunate in this role that I get to do the actual work we do. And so that looks like educators, neighborhood groups, or get to be part of the Work of Fred conference and welcome people and attend sessions. And I feel like I get to learn from people every day, and that feels like what my job is, which is kind of unbelievable. And to be associated with all of the people who choose to connect with a place like the Fred Rogers Institute is just such a gift. We have, as you both know, like the most wonderful people in
Mhm.
our orbit. And I'm just so grateful. It's definitely a pinch me kind of job.
Oh, it definitely is. I feel like Kenzie and I often talk about this, that we're so fortunate to work where we do and to be able to like uphold a legacy of somebody so great as Fred. And we are the only Fred Rogers Institute in the world. And there's so few of us who get the opportunity to work here that it really is, like you said, like a pinch me kind of job. And I love that you talked about like you get to do the actual work. And I will say, Kenzie and I can attest that you are very hands-on in the best way kind of director, in that you don't, just come up with ideas and say, go do it. You're actually in it with us. And for those who don't know, there's only 7 of us who work at the Fred Rogers Institute full time. We have a couple of graduate assistants. We have a couple of students who are undergrads at St. Vincent who work with us part time, and help us tremendously behind the scenes with all of our programming. But there's only 7 of us full time, and that includes you, Emma, and you're a great leader. So I'll just say that.
Well, Thank you very much. We have just an incredible team, and it all is very much teamwork to do what we do. And I'm always kind of amazed looking back over a year, all of the things that we all got to do. And I know we just sit around and talk about like, do we really get to have this job? Like, wow, it's so fun. Yeah.
Speaking of that too, like, and you said this a little bit about your favorite parts of your job. What's your favorite thing you've done in the past year as director of the Fred Rogers Institute?
Oh, wow. This is a great question. It's really hard to pick a favorite thing. But what's coming to mind is Educators Neighborhood, which I know we've talked about on the podcast, is just such an incredible program. And in this past year, we've been able to do Educators Neighborhood with one school. There's a school here in Pittsburgh. It's called Shady Lane School, and Fred Rogers actually helped found this school 60 years ago. And we've been able to do Educators Neighborhood with this whole group of early childhood educators that are all in one place. And so it's been such a cool experience to go to Shady Lane once a month and talk with a group who works together every single day about what does trust look like in your work together? Like, how do you trust each other to be great educators and caregivers for these children here at Shady Lane? And what does it look like to engage with curiosity in your work every day? And these are the conversations that we are having with educators all the time across the country and across the world. And it's really different and special and unique to have it with a group of people who work together all of the time. So it's been really cool to get to apply this model that we've been learning and figuring out for several years, and now take it to one school and see what it looks like for a group of people there. That's been really fun.
Yeah, and it almost feels full circle because Educators Neighborhood in general started off in as a physical in-person group in a Pittsburgh school too. So that
Mhm.
must be amazing to see as well. Um, but speaking of that, and all of the wonderful work that you do and we do at the Institute, why do you do what you do? What inspired you to step into the role as director or even come to the Institute and do all the amazing leadership that you do every day?
I have always known that I wanted to do something to help people. I remember when I was trying to think about selecting a college major, I remember talking to people about, well, I'm going to do psychology because I don't know exactly what I want to do, but I know I want to help people. So I might as well spend, these years in undergrad learning about people and how we work. And I found my way right after I graduated from college to the education space, and I worked in policy in North Carolina for a little bit. And just immediately in that work, learned that early childhood was this area that I really wanted to focus. The first few years of a person's life are just so deeply important. And I felt really inspired by that. So I went to grad school to keep going further into the early years of how we learn and grow. And in grad school is when I really figured out if I want to be supportive of young children, um, I want to focus on the adults and their lives. So it's been this kind of building thing through my career, which I think is what all of us experience when we have the like incredible fortune to get to have some choice in what we do in our careers. And so I'd been working my way toward, all right, I want to focus on young children, but I actually want to focus on the adults in their lives. And I ended up moving to Pittsburgh. That's when I learned that Fred Rogers was here for his life. I grew up watching Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, but didn't know that Pittsburgh was home and for him until I came here and came to this area and I discovered the Fred Rogers Institute and really truly just kind of stalked the website for a couple of years looking for job openings, and was finally able to come here 8 years ago, I think it was, as a project support person on Simple Interactions at the time. And it was just so much of what I had been looking for because it was a way to be working with adults in an encouraging way. I had worked in policy, I'd worked in research, and so much of what I had seen were these kind of coming in from the outside interventions to try to improve things that were happening. And a lot of it was wonderful and really great things that were being done to support schools. But it was also a lot that was being done to say, hey, teachers, here's a thing you need to do, and here's exactly how you need to do it. And we're going to measure how well you as a teacher are doing this thing that we have a theory will be helpful on some very specific measure. There's a valuable place for all of that. But coming to the Fred Rogers Institute was like finally finding a place where the focus was on what are we, what's really, really essential here, and how can we support what's already good in what's happening for children through the adults that are in their lives. And it was just an incredible opportunity to get to be here and have been here ever since. And I love it.
I love hearing your story of like how you came here. And I love one thing that you mentioned in all of that when you talked about choosing your career path or choosing what you want to do. You referred to it as like what a good fortune of like like being so fortunate to be able to choose your path. And I feel like that's really I like the way that you framed that. It's really important to think about because I think sometimes that can feel really overwhelming and that can feel really scary, especially as a young person with your whole career path ahead of you. There are so many options and there are so many great options, and especially in a case like you were in where you were like, I want to help people.
Yep.
How much bigger of an area can you choose? Um, but to say like how fortunate I am to be able to choose what I want to do and how I want to help people. I think that's really neat. Um,
Yeah.
Also, it's very cool for me to hear like your story of coming to the Institute because I know when you started, I was an undergraduate student at St. Vincent and working, part-time with the Institute. And I remember when you started and
Yeah.
so it's been cool to like from my perspective seeing you from like a mentor role from the beginning and up until, me coming on full time and still being able to work with you. So that's been a wonderful thing in my path of the Fred Rogers Institute.
Yeah. Same. Same. We've all grown together here quite a bit.
Yes. So thinking, along these lines of you wanted to help people, you wanted to help the adults serving young children, really focusing on those early years. Um, we really wanted to take this first episode of the second season as an opportunity to really dive into this idea of looking for the helpers. Obviously we start every episode reminding people of the quote where Fred talked about his mom reminding him to look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping. Um, we, and I am using a very large collective we, as anybody who knows about Fred Rogers ever, we tend to find so much comfort in that quote, and we think of Fred and this idea of helpers helping, looking for the helpers. Um, and I'm wondering, what is your stance on like why do you think we turn to Fred and his words in like the hard times, the scary times, what that idea of finding comfort in that idea of looking for the helpers? Why do you think that is? Why do you think we turn to Fred's words in those times?
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot because we do, here at the Institute, we get direct calls and messages from people kind of seeking wisdom from Fred Rogers and saying things like what would Mr. Rogers do if he were here today? What would Fred say about this particular situation we're experiencing? Um, so yeah, we've all had the chance to think about that a lot. And when we're feeling scared and uncertain, it's just human nature that we want to turn to comfort and support and someone that we can trust who will provide stability. And um, Mr. Rogers did that for so many of us, so many generations. of people in this country especially grew up watching Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and I know I felt this, and we hear these stories all the time of people who watched Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood because that was a grown-up in their life who they trusted. And even for people who maybe didn't grow up with Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood in that in that way that people really have described, saying, I didn't have adults in my life that I could really rely on, but Mr. Rogers was always there and he talked to me. Um, Even for those of us that Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was like a great show that we watched sometimes, or maybe even didn't. Fred Rogers and Mr. Rogers have come to represent what's good about grown-ups, for us as children. So he was for many of us, and at least represents for so many of us, this goodness and a stability and a trust that we can turn to, which is why I think we see Fred quotes shared on social media all the time, and particularly in the aftermath of something really difficult happening. We see that look for the helpers quote shared over and over.
So, as we talk about kind of Fred serving as like a helper even 20 years after his death and, people finding inspiration from his messages, what do you think it means to be a helper?
I think that to be a helper is really about the actions that we take. Um, if you kind of search helper, there are all these like roles associated with that. We think about teachers, nurses, police officers, firefighters. There's these roles and uniforms and images that come to mind, but I think actually, really, what is a helper? Well, it's somebody who helps. It's somebody who is, and that's an action. It's somebody who's showing up
Mm.
to do something good for someone else and offer something that's needed. And so there are roles and professions and ways of being in the world that kind of identify us as, oh, you might be a helper. But ultimately, it's just about what we do, not at all about what our role might be.
So, with that action though, like how do you think a person can be a helper?
Well, I think that a helper, like I said, a helper is someone that we can trust. So a helper is somebody who is showing through actions. I will, I'm thinking about a child, right? And what is it, what does a helper look like to a child? And I think it's an adult who says and shows through their actions, I will take care of you. I will protect you and keep you safe. I will provide stability and security to the best of my ability, even in the midst of real discomfort or fear. Um, and I think, tangibly, it looks like all kinds of things, but it's about that action of offering care, and connection, no matter what context we're in or who it is we're interacting with.
So talking about this idea of looking for the helpers and being a helper, um, and obviously it's so tied to that quote that we know Fred is so famous for. Can you speak a little bit more about the context of that quote? Because a lot of people know that quote. A lot of people associate Fred with that quote, look for the helpers, but a lot of people don't know where it came from. A lot of people don't know that his mom was the one that said it to him, not him saying it to the world first, you know? So can you speak a little bit about the context of that quote?
I would love to. And I actually, in anticipation of this conversation, I asked Emily, our archivist, who I know was on the podcast last season, if she could pull like all of the times that Fred mentioned that idea of look for the helpers, because I was really curious, when did he choose to bring that up? Um, and the anytime he referenced that, he was saying, when I was young and I would see scary things in the news, my mom would tell me to look for the helpers because I will always find people who are helping. And when I find people who are helping, I know that there is some hope. So he shared that idea a couple different times. And what Emily was able to find in our archive is a few. And I think it's really important to think about like the context in which he chose to share that with the world. So in one case in 1996, Fred spoke at the graduation ceremony for Latrobe High School here, his hometown. And he was talking to young people who are graduating from high school. And he was sharing a story about an important person in his life who had died. And that was one time that he brought up this idea of when something really sad happened, his mom would tell him to look for the helpers. And he was talking to these young people about how they have the ability to be helpers and show up as helpers. He also referenced this look for the helpers message from his mom after September 11th. After September 11th, there was a newspaper article that came out with Mr. Rogers sharing some thoughts. He also came out of retirement to do a public service announcement, and this was a video message that was intended for adults. He was speaking directly to adults about how to support children with really difficult news. And he talked about looking for the helpers and finding who was helping, because that could be such a comfort to children who were understanding this really horrible thing that had happened. And also at the same time, the family communications who created the show put out a document helping young children deal with tragic events in the news, and that was Fred Rogers and Hedda Sharapin who co-created that, and that was another place where they shared this. And then the most the first time that Emily was able to find, at least in the archive, when Fred Rogers spoke about this idea from his mom was actually in 1981 in a special episode of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood that was released. And this was one of the times that Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was put out in a special way. And at the beginning of this episode, he's speaking to his television friend, as he always does. And he said, this is an episode that you should watch with a grown up. So he's talking to the children who are watching, and he says, this is for you and your grown up to watch together. And in 1981, the context of what was happening in the world was a lot of really, really scary and sad and devastating news. And I'll mention the ones that he specifically mentioned in the episode. He talks about um, John Lennon being shot in New York, President Reagan and his friends in Washington, the Pope in Rome. These were all assassinations or assassination attempts that happened in that 1980 to 81 range. And then there was also a serial killer in Atlanta who was killing children. And so this is the context in which Mr. Rogers decided to release this special episode. And he talked about what his mother said to him. Look for the helpers. You will find people who are helping. And, there are times when that quote is shared on social media and it's being shared a little bit inaccurately. It's shared by adults who are sharing it with other adults as a way of comforting ourselves. And I believe it is completely true that as adults, we need to know that there are helpers around us. We need to know that. We need to be able to look and see the other adults who are helping. But it's an inauthentic use of Fred Rogers' message because he was always sharing it to say, hey, children can look for adults as helpers. So that's us. And so, but I think there's this even deeper layer to this message that, well, I've heard people talk about that idea that when we say look for the helpers, we are the helpers, we need to be the helpers. Um, I think there's something really important that we should be talking about now when we're talking to children about what is a helper. Um, because for a lot of children, the people in their life who should be a helper are a helper. Their parents, their family members, their teachers, the helpers in their community, those folks in uniforms that we associate with being helpers. For a lot of children, that is their experience, that the people in roles that we think should be helpers are helpers. And for a lot of children and a lot of people, those people who we think should be helpers might not be. And this has always been the case. There have always been people who we believe to be helpers. Um, I'm thinking about parents. We think parents are helpers, and so often they are. Most of the time they are, right? But there are still times when parents or other people in roles of helping turn to violence or neglect when they as adults are feeling afraid or uncomfortable. And so just as much as there have always been helpers who do not act like helpers. There have also always been helpers who in their acting like helpers are hurt or pushed out or even killed in the moments when they're doing their helping work. I'm thinking about nurses, soldiers, neighbors, people who are standing up and doing really good helping work, and they're being hurt. And that's really confusing. How do we explain to a child what a helper is if we see people who are helpers doing the hurting, or we see people who are helpers but they're being hurt? Um, and I think we really can trust children to trust themselves and their own knowing that we all have inside of us about what a helper is. A helper is someone that we can trust, someone who is showing us that they are going to protect us, that they're going to care for people. That's what a helper is. That was exactly the same in 1981 when Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood came out with a special episode because they knew horrible things were happening and children were hearing about it, and it was confusing and scary and hard. Um, a lot of the time, people will ask, what would Mr. Rogers do today? Things are so scary, things are so hard. Um, what would Mr. Rogers say if he were here? And we don't know. We can't know. Fred Rogers is not here for us to talk to, but we do know what he did say and how he did act in his time. And while there are things happening today that are horrific and scary, it's true that horrific and scary things were happening when he was doing his work too. Um, the 1960s in the United States were not a calm time. This 1981 episode came out because horrific things were happening. And Fred Rogers would let children know, look for the people who are helping. His mother did not say, look for a certain type of role or a profession. Um, she said, look for the people who are helping. So a helper is a person who's helping, regardless of what they're wearing, what we expect of them, what we don't expect of them. A helper is a person who's showing up.
I love that explanation of a helper being a person who is helping. I feel like it sounds so simple. I mean, we often at the Fred Rogers Institute talk about the idea of simple and deep. And that I think is a wonderful example of simple and deep. A person who is a helper who is helping. So simple, but it's so true. And that is an excellent way to look for a helper. Not necessarily, like you said, a certain role or a certain uniform or a certain type of person doing a type of thing. No expectations one way or the other, but just what are their actions showing us? Are they helping? Are they truly helping? Um, One question, just because I know you said that you had Emily pull some archive material for you about that episode in 1981 around all the context of all of those really scary and horrific things happening in the world. Um, in that episode, for the listeners who can't see that actual script of the episode or see the actual episode, can you clarify, did Fred actually name those things in the episode, or did he kind of talk around them, or did he say someone got assassinated, there was an assassination attempt, people are dying? Like how how clear was he about those scary things happening in the language that he used for kids and the grown-ups, but for kids?
Yeah. I I'll just read the words. I'll read some of these words that were in the very beginning of this episode. So Mr. Rogers said to the camera, all over the world, there's so much violence in the news. I felt it was urgent to talk with families about it. This program is not for young children to watch alone. When children see and hear about frightening things, it's best for them to have an adult close by, someone who loves them and can put their arm around them. So please get a grown up that you love to watch this program with you because we're going to talk about some sad and scary things. There are people in the world who are so sick or so angry that they sometimes hurt other people. And they're usually the ones who end up in the news. Remember hearing about John Lennon being shot in New York, and President Reagan and his friends in Washington, and the Pope in Rome, and the young people being murdered in Atlanta and other places. Well, the people who are doing these terrible things are making a lot of other people sad and angry. But when we get sad and angry, you and I, we know what to do with our feelings so we don't have to hurt other people. The other day, I talked with some school children about some of these things, and I'd like you to hear what they have to say. And so then in the episode, we cut to Mr. Rogers having a conversation with children in school, and they are mentioning these specific things they saw in the news.
That's so interesting. And through our work at the Institute, we have seen archive items that have shown us that Fred didn't stray away from talking about challenging things with children. And there was no, sugarcoat it, shove it under the rug, let's pretend it doesn't exist. He was always very direct and honest. And that example that you just read, I don't think it could be any more direct and talking about these terrible things that are happening at that time. And I think
Mm-hmm.
I think it's hard to talk about those things or scary things in general, but especially when you're talking to young children, that
Yeah.
I don't know, that would have never crossed my mind to say, let me actually say the words of what's going on and be honest about what's happening to a young child. But that just because I don't want to talk about it or I'm not comfortable talking about it doesn't mean that young children don't hear it and see it and know what's going on and have questions about it.
Yeah. And when this happened in 1981, children were seeing these things maybe on their televisions. They were hearing adults talk about them, but the technology didn't exist yet. People didn't have smartphones in their pockets. That, as we've moved forward in time, children haven't changed. The things that happen in the world have not changed. But our access to information has changed. And so even, I was looking through this document that Family Communications released after September 11th, and they spoke to that exactly, that we might think that young children don't know what's going on, but they have almost certainly heard something. They've heard something they have experienced in their bodies, the what we're all talking about around them, and left to their own devices, they will imagine and fill in the blanks. And so it is, I'm completely with you, Sarah. It's really scary to think about bringing up something so horrible and specific with children, but that is part of what being a helper is naming naming something so that it can be there and we could talk about it. And it doesn't mean at all offering up all of the details, but simply just bringing up, there's something going on and I wonder what you've heard about it. Um, can just let children know that we're there for it if they do have something that they've heard that they want to talk about.
One of my favorite, like, I don't know, parts about Fred, something that he did often, it wasn't always like, okay, I want you to stick your child in front of this TV and I'll talk to them. He always encouraged parents and families to have these conversations. And again, going back to the archive, I feel like I've seen a lot of different archive materials related to how parents and guardians and families can talk to their children about a large variety of topics. Like, I don't know, I know off the top of my head, like puppets, for instance.
Mhm.
And I don't know, I just having this conversation makes me think of that and how inclusive Fred was in that way.
So I'm wondering, you know, we've established the idea that children see things and hear things, whether we want them to or not, the good, the bad, the scary, everything in between. And we want to encourage them to look for the helpers. We want to encourage them to find adults that they can trust and consider them helpers, look for people who are doing the actual helping. But I know that the idea of stranger danger is also real,
Mhm.
and that's also a thing. And it's not necessarily realistic to tell children any adult is somebody that you can trust. Any adult or grown up is somebody that could be a helper to you if you need a helper. No matter how much we want that to be true, the reality is that that is unfortunately not always true. And I know when I was growing up in school, stranger danger was like that's something that like if you're there's a stranger, you stay away. If a stranger comes up to you and asks you a question, you don't answer. You know what I mean? Like that I feel like it seems very opposite to look for the helpers, but I think both are true and that's confusing and especially, as a mom of a toddler, that's something that as my son gets older, I'm gonna have to figure out how to teach him, okay, look for the helpers, but also like how and who and where does stranger danger come into the mix? Can you speak a little bit to that? Because I mean, I know from your professional standpoint and as a mom too, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I actually read something about this several years ago that I found so true and so helpful. Um, I also like grew up, I mean, stranger danger, we were taught about that in schools. Like it was this message. Um, but but in truth, we talk to people we don't know all the time, or hopefully that's how are we going to get to know our neighbors if we're not talking to somebody who is at first a stranger. Um, and I think it does a disservice to be teaching children that just because you don't already know somebody means they can't be trusted. Um, and how do we teach our children about safety? So I read something helpful, which is that instead of stranger danger, we can talk to children about trusted adults, or like tricky adults was the term that I read a while ago, which is um, a tricky adult might be someone who is an adult asking a very young person for help. If an adult you don't know is asking you for help, or asking you to keep a secret, or asking you to go somewhere um, without your trusted people, that's tricky. That's not a safe person. They're not acting in a safe way. So there are like specific types of actions and behaviors and things that an adult might say to a child to indicate this isn't a person that I should trust. Um, and that goes back to this idea that a helper is a person who helps. Um, it's about the behaviors and the actions that a person is taking. So the truth is, children need to be able to talk to grown-ups. That's something that kindergarten teachers are asking for. Like, if anything, help make sure that your child knows they can talk to a grown-up and ask a grown-up for help. Um, and I think that it's true that most adults are eager to help a child who needs some help or is lost and is trying to find their parent. Um, and so when we talk to children about like adults who can be trusted, it's people who are showing us that they can be trusted. And Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, I think, brought some terms into our just regular way of speaking. Neighbor, neighborhood. Mr. Rogers didn't create that, but certainly it seems like his emphasis on neighbors and neighborliness has really influenced our culture, I think. And there's this deep comfort in the idea that any of our neighbors can be a helper. And I think that's also true. For in almost all cases, our neighbors are helpers. And um, I hope that my girls grow up expecting that the new people they might meet um, might be friends, might be helpers. And I don't want any of us to grow up being immediately skeptical of a new person simply because we don't already know them. Um, if we are teaching our children to like listen to what's inside of us and what's indicating to us, are you safe or are you asking me for something that's like not appropriate and scary? That's how we can kind of differentiate as we're getting to know someone. Are they a helper? Are they a friend? Or are they maybe not safe for me?
I think you framing it as like a helper versus a tricky adult, that
Mm-hmm.
feels a lot more approachable than stranger danger. Stranger danger is scary. That does make me feel skeptical of the world. Like
Yeah.
immediately cynical, skeptical. I don't want to talk to anybody new. A tricky adult is maybe I should just be aware of my surroundings
Mm-hmm.
and I want to make new friends and I hope you're a helper, but I'm also gonna be, just scoping out what's going on and I'm gonna so I think that feels more approachable and I like that and that's I think something that I imagine that young people would remember.
I think
Mhm.
so. And trust is something that's earned. We can start from a position of assuming the best. But trust is something that is earned in time through conversation and getting to know somebody. We don't meet a new person and just immediately trust them with all of ourselves. But and I think we can trust children to understand that. I mean, from the moment they're born, they're figuring out what can I trust? Who can I trust? We're wired to
Mhm.
want that and to look for it and to feel it and understand it. So um I hope that we can all think about um new people not as dangerous strangers. I mean, my goodness, like think about the horrible implications for our entire world if
Mhm.
we assume every stranger is a dangerous person. But when like it's really just true that most people that we don't know yet could be a friend, could be a helper. And
Absolutely.
we know, children know how to trust a person. I mean, anybody who's ever walked into a classroom, um, you, young people are the best at identifying, are you an authentic person? Are you telling the
Yes.
truth or are you trying to trick me about something?
Yep.
Kids
Mm.
know. We can learn from that.
Yes. And I also can imagine that as an adult, whether you're a parent or a caregiver or a teacher, if you're already in a role of being a trusted adult to a child, I can imagine that it would be helpful to give examples in like real time of look at that person helping. They're
Yeah.
helping because XYZ. Or look at how that person helped someone else get something off the top shelf from the grocery store. That's a good
Mhm.
helper. I can imagine like just going about daily life or that person, that crossing guard told those children when it was safe to cross the street. That was a great helper. And I can imagine like working that into normal conversations so that if and when a child is in a circumstance of I want or need to find somebody that I can trust and somebody to help me because of whatever is going on. Oh, these are the things I remember as like helping behaviors, and maybe these are some things that I can look for.
Absolutely. I think that's it.
Yeah, Emma, and through your work, like both in the Institute and obviously breaking down the role of a helper and the definition of a helper, what do you think is something that you wish people knew about being a helper?
I hope that we can all know that being a helper is just a choice. It's not, um, as we've been talking about, being a helper, even though there's been this association, being a helper doesn't have anything to do with a uniform, a job title, a role in a family. It's really something we choose in any moment. Are we going to show up as a helper or not? And we get to choose to, are we selective helpers? Are we only helping some people or some types of people or only in some circumstances or situations? All of these things are their choices. How we behave is within our control. And Mr. Rogers was saying that to young children who were um, trying to make sense of why would people hurt other people? And Mr. Rogers was saying, you and I know that there are things we can do with our feelings of anger and sadness so that we don't hurt people. Um, and it's the same. We can do things with our feelings to choose to help people.
I love that idea of framing it as a choice to help. And I think something else that's important to note is that if someone chooses something that hurts someone else, that doesn't mean that they can never be a helper again. That doesn't mean that they are always a quote unquote bad person. You can make a choice that's maybe a not so great choice, a choice that hurts somebody, but then you can also make choices that help people and are positive things too. One choice doesn't have to label you for all of eternity. Um, I think sometimes it feels like people aren't allowed to change their minds or choose a different path and um,
Mhm.
I think it's important to know that that's okay to choose to be a helper, but to choose at any time to start being a helper.
And thank goodness for that, because I have made lots of choices that have hurt people. I have even chosen to be hurtful when I've been really hurt and upset. And it makes me think about one of the songs in Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood about the very same people who are sad sometimes, can also be happy sometimes, and the same people who at sometimes do not act like helpers, at other times can act like helpers. And I think that's just another thing that's like helpful to see these as this is separate from a job, a role. It's a way you show up in any moment.
Yes, absolutely. And I think another thing that I like to think about when you talked about that really direct episode where, he's talking about looking for the helpers in really scary times. But you also mentioned that in the archive, you found that he mentioned that, hearing from his mom, look for the helpers, giving a graduation speech to high school students. So, yes, he talked about that idea of helpers and helping in really, really scary, awful, terrible times, but also really hopeful times too. And like the new beginnings of let's be helpers and this is the next generation of helpers. So I think that that also speaks to that idea of, looking for the helpers can be in the good times too.
Yeah, completely agree.
Do you have any final thoughts for our listeners, Emma? Anything that you wanted to share?
I loved reading these things that Emily pulled out of the archive for me, and I had all of these questions for her about um, this look for the helpers quote that we've all been very familiar with for a long time, but I realized I need to know more I want to know more about when and why did he say this. And so I think what I do want to share is that the Fred Rogers Archive is like really, really cool collection of Fred's work. And I don't ever want any of us to think that we need to learn more from Fred Rogers so that we can be like Fred Rogers, but so that we can be more like ourselves. And that's what I always I just feel so lucky that this is the work I get to do sometimes of reading how he interacted with the world and the things that were happening and what he chose to bring to children. There's so much that I learn from that that influences how I show up in my job and in my family. And um, I don't know if we've been able to talk about this publicly a whole lot yet, but we've been in the process here at the Institute of digitizing everything that's in the archive. For 20 years, we've had this archive, and it's always been accessible to people to come and ask to read about something that Fred did or wrote about or thought about. And we've been able to pull it out, and you can sit at a table, and that is a really special thing to get to sit down and look at scripts with his handwriting. But we're digitizing everything for one, so that it's all preserved, but especially so that it's more accessible. So I was able to ask Emily, hey, can you find when Fred Rogers talked about this? And even though I'm literally upstairs and could have walked down and held on to these pieces of paper, she put it in this folder for me online and shared it. And so I was able to look through it. And that's something that will be increasingly available to everyone. Anyone who's interested in learning more from Fred Rogers and his work can just contact the archivist here at the Fred Rogers Institute, and we'll put together a selection of items for anybody who wants to read more about Fred's work. So I definitely wanted to make sure that everybody knows about that, and we'll be, of course, shouting that from the rooftops as we get closer and closer to it all being digitized. We're still in the process of making it happen, but it's been a really exciting thing, and I'm thrilled that more people will be able to access all of this.
I'm so glad that you shared that. Thank you so much, Emma. And thank you again for your time out of your busy director's schedule to join us for this episode of Listen to the Helpers. And yeah, thank you again for sharing your thoughts and for everything that you do for the Fred Rogers Institute and for extending the legacy of Fred Rogers every day.
Right back at you, Sarah and Kenzee. Thank you. I'm loving these conversations, and it was good. It was such a gift to be able to do one. So thank you both.
Kenzee, what did you think about that conversation with our beloved Emma?
Honestly, Sarah, I don't even know where to start because she said so many good things within our conversation. Where to begin? I guess first and foremost, what stuck out to me is how she thought of helping, especially how helping is an action and the idea about helping in general just being a choice. Like people can choose to be a helper, whether or not to be a helper. Um, because we put it in our heads that being a helper is this dramatic thing and you have to be perfect all the time to be like the perfect helper, but it's really not at the end of the day.
Yeah, I agree that that definitely stood out to me, and I said it before, but it's simple and deep. The
Yep.
idea of you can choose to help. Helping is an action. Helpers are people who are helping, and it doesn't have to be complicated. Um, yeah, I like that she talked a lot about how sometimes we have expectations of who helpers are or who helpers should be or shouldn't be. And sometimes those expectations are true and accurate, and sometimes they're not. And that can throw people for a loop when those expectations are wrong. If you expect somebody to be a helper and they're not, or if you don't expect somebody to be a helper and they are, um, it can kind of rattle you a little bit and you think I don't know really where to go from here. Who can I trust? Who can't I trust? But I think Emma made some really, really great points of who to look for and maybe who to not look for in times of need.
Yeah, I also wrote down the term selective helper.
Mm,
That's sticking with me a little bit. Just this idea that, you know, while no one can be the perfect helper, it's important to be a helper, not to be so much selective and choose when and where to help. I don't know. What did you think about that term, selective
yeah.
helper?
I've never thought about that term before, but I really like that as well. And it goes back to thinking about helping as a choice. And I
Yeah.
I like that Emma also brought up the song. She referred to Fred's song "Sometimes People Are Good,"
Mhm.
and she referenced some of the words. But for those of you who are listening who might not be as familiar with the song, the first few lyrics are sometimes people are good and they do just what they should, but the very same people who are good sometimes are the very same people who are bad sometimes. It's funny, but it's true. It's the same, isn't it, for me and you? And it, I think that speaks to the point of you can choose to be a helper and you could choose not to be a helper. And
Mhm.
that doesn't mean that you are forever a helper or you're forever not a helper. If you're a helper, you have to continue to choose helping, you know? And just because you helped somebody one time, it's not a box to check. And sometimes people are good and sometimes people are bad and sometimes people make great decisions and sometimes people don't. And it's the same for me and you. Like the song is just that speaks I don't know. That just speaks to the whole conversation I think that we had with Emma.
Yeah, and it definitely ties back into this idea of the fundamental trust. It's all
Hmm.
about being a trusted adult and being consistent about being a trusted adult, and being that grown up that children can come to when they need help. Is there another particular fundamental that stuck out to you this conversation?
I think trust was the big one. And I think Emma talked a little bit about the idea of meeting new people and being neighborly and, trying not to be immediately skeptical of everyone around you. And that's reminding me of a sense of curiosity, especially for young people who have this innate sense of curiosity. And as adults and helpers, we want to help foster that curiosity. So we want to encourage them to not only look for the helpers, but to meet new people and learn about people and meet people who are different from you. And whether that's, I like pink and you like blue, or if it's,
Yeah.
I like this food and you like that food, or if it's, bigger differences of I'm from this place and you're from that place. Um, I
Mhm.
think that's making me think of curiosity and how we ultimately want to do the best that we can to foster our own curiosity, but help young people foster that sense of curiosity too, and not teach them so much of that stranger danger idea that it kind of squashes the curiosity.
Yeah, and I believe Emma did say this, that children are just generally curious by nature. They can tell when you're authentic or not. And that's
Mhm.
something that is one of the most important, like quoting Fred, works of childhood is play. And then I would also consider curiosity to be that way too.
Is there anything else from that conversation with Emma that's kind of sticking with you?
I really like how she looked at Fred's own use of look for the helpers throughout his life, and how he used it to talk to families and parents and children. And I believe that my favorite one, though I all of them are great, was his speech to young people in 1996 at the local high school. Just because I think Fred did a wonderful job of helping the helpers in the case that like he encouraged parents and families to have these difficult conversations with children, but he's also encouraging young people who are going, whether they're going to helping professions themselves or are just going to grow up to be strong helpers, to have these conversations with children and be a safe place. Sarah and I encourage people to reach out to our archivist, Emily, and we'll put a link in the description of this episode so you can contact her to learn more from Fred. Not only can you read about the things that he said about helpers in our archive, but there are a large number of different topics that are surely interesting and could be helpful for you in your profession or in your personal life to talk to the children or the helpers or the people around you, and learn more from Fred as we do every day in our work at the Fred Rogers Institute.
Yes, absolutely. And because this second season of Listen to the Helpers is kicking off when it is, I'm also going to put a little plug in here that if anybody who is listening is interested in learning more about our Educators Neighborhood program, Emma mentioned that at the very beginning of this episode, that she enjoys running some of our small groups for that program. Please check out our Educators Neighborhood program if you are interested in learning more or applying to join. You can learn more at fredrogersinstitute.org. Please also consider checking out our annual Work of Fred Rogers conference. It's coming up in July, so you can explore more, learn more about it, register. It's in person at the Fred Rogers Institute in Latrobe, so you can come visit Fred's hometown if you haven't already. You can come meet Kenzee and I in person, and Emma and Emily. The whole team will be there. So we hope that you'll check out that opportunity to come visit us and to extend Fred's legacy and learn more from him and from others who are inspired by him and the work that they do every single day. I also want to put one last plug in there that we cannot stress enough how thankful we are for Emma. She is such an incredible leader, such an incredible mentor, professionally and personally, for both Kenzee and I. And we are truly thankful for the jobs that we have because Emma is such a wonderful, wonderful presence. Yeah, Kenzee, do you have anything else to add about how amazing Emma is? I can't say enough wonderful things about her.
Right, where to even begin? Again, a lot of the work that we do is all about helping the helpers, and Emma herself is not only a helper, but she is, I don't know, helping us in our work is like as you said, she's our mentor. So I don't know. It is a joy to always get to talk to her and to get to do this and have her on the podcast is just extra special. So thank you, Emma. The Fred Rogers Institute advances the legacy of Fred Rogers by investing in the strengths of families and caring adults to support the healthy development of children. To learn more about the Fred Rogers Institute and our initiatives, visit fredrogersinstitute.org and follow the Fred Rogers Institute on Instagram, Facebook, and X.